Hello, everyone. My name is Jeremy Losak. This is my research assistant, John Asel. We're coming to you from Syracuse University. Before we get started, just want to say a huge thanks to SABR for putting this together. I've been staring at a black box screen for SABR conferences the last few years, so it's just really awesome to be able to come in person and speak to you all collectively. Big thanks to Mark Simon for all the work that he does in organizing these research presentations. I've had the chance to interact with him and Scott Bush the last few years with the research presentations, and they do such a great job organizing this and reading through everything. So a huge thank you to those guys and the people at SABR. So today we're going to give a presentation on aging curves, comparing aging curves for the MLB, KBO, and NPB, which is quite appropriate given that we have the WBC going on.
Fantastic.
Let's see, that's not working. Oh, there we go.
Nice. Around the world, the game played on the field is relatively the same. 90 feet between bases, 3 outs in an inning, but the structure surrounding the game varies wildly by league. MLB plays about 20 more games per season than either Japan's NPB or Korea's KBO. Similarly, the MLB has a far more elaborate minor league system than either of those aforementioned leagues. But the question is, how does this impact the players? How does this affect how they age within these leagues? To answer this, we need to use aging curves. Aging curves is a quantitative way, a statistical way of, quantifying the interaction between performance and age. Now, you can use any number of performance measures, but thus far, most of the aging curve analysis has been done on the MLB, while the NPB and the KBO has been somewhat neglected. But it is an interesting question. How does the increasing experience of a player with age counteract against the physical decline that comes with?
So before we get into what we do, we want to give you a brief history of the methodology of aging curves. And it's not a very old history. In fact, aging curve methodology starts coming into play probably around the mid to late 2000s. So not a very old literature. And typically there's two methodologies that we see early on that helped us progress to where we are today in terms of how we consider how players age. The first is the Bradbury method. It's a more academic method and fairly simple. The general idea is that you have a linear regression, you have an age term, you have a quadratic age term, you fit that term and you get a really nice curvy looking shape. And this shape, this parabola, has a number of benefits. One, it's really easy to interpret. Two, it's really easy to estimate. Three, it has some nice features. For example, you could estimate a peak, which is oftentimes what a lot of people are interested in when they think about aging. So they're really, really nice in that regard. And you could do it for a whole number of statistical categories, as you could see here in the plot. One of the downsides to aging curves, though, or specifically the Bradbury method, comes with this picture here, this curve, this symmetric curve. It treats aging as the same on both sides of the peak, which may not be representative of what how aging actually occurs. The idea is that we have this rise and this fall that might not be representative of actual aging patterns. On the flip side, we have the delta method. The delta method, popularized by Tango and Lichtman, a pretty powerful approach and one of the earlier methods as well. It's funny, actually. I remember back when I was a student doing case comps, and I used one of these in 2015. So we've definitely progressed since then. But the idea behind the delta method is that instead of using individual seasons of data, it instead looks at pairs of data. For example, we have Jose Abreu here on the right, and we have data for his age 27 through 32 seasons. The way the delta method works is rather than look at his age 27 number and his age 28 number, instead what we do is we take the difference in his 28 to 27 and the difference between his 29 to 28. And then we take those for all the players in our sample and we average them out, and that produces kind of this average aging trend. The value of this is that we let the data speak for itself in terms of the effects on aging. There are some downsides. So comparing the Bradbury and delta methods before we move on to what we do, the Bradbury method has that really nice interpretable piece, but it does have that really strong simplifying quadratic assumption. which the delta method has that non-parametric method. The delta method, on the other hand, and why the delta method loses favor in some contexts, is because it requires a lot of data. Why is that? Because when you rely on seasoned pairs of data, you inevitably will lose observations. If I have 6 observations for an individual, I have to lose one of them in order to get the differences in 5. This becomes even more problematic if then we lose data because of not qualifying for a particular stat or injury. All of a sudden now you're losing a lot of observations when you incorporate this methodology, which the Bradbury method doesn't rely on that same, or doesn't have that same problem. You don't need as much data in order to implement it. Before I talk about the methodology we do use, which builds on both of these methods, I want to talk a little bit about survivor bias, because survivor bias is a pretty significant, or has been talked about to be a pretty significant issue in the aging curve methodologies. What is survivor bias? It's the idea that essentially older players are the ones that are making it to the advanced ages, such that when we estimate the effects of aging curves, it's those older players that are driving all of our results. And if older players age better, which some people assume to be the case, if older players age better, or sorry, if better players age better than lower quality players, then we might systematically underrepresent the effects of aging. We aren't as concerned about, well, we're not sure if we're concerned about this for 2 reasons. One, the methodology that's used to address this often involves simulating ghost data, essentially trying to replicate what a player's career would look like had that player not left the sample, which has its own sets of econometric measurement issues, strong assumptions and the like. The other reason is because it relies on that statement that better players age differently than lower quality players. And to our knowledge, there's no evidence of that. It makes some... It makes sense why some might believe that to be the case, but older players still age. The question is not whether or not older players, it's not as much of an issue that older players are driving the end of our sample, as long as those better players are driving the end of our sample, as long as they age in a similar way as lesser quality players, which we have no reason at this point not to believe that to be the case. At least nobody has proved otherwise. So we go from there. So where we go next then is a general additive model, a gamma cross model. This approach, at least in regards to aging patterns, was applied to sports by 2 individuals. Turturro in 2019 applied this to NHL data. And then Judge in 2020 had a really nice article where he applied this GAM model to aging. And not only did he do that, but then he validated this methodology compared to some of the other methods that we talked about, and highlighted that this GAM, this generalized additive model approach, has a better fit to the data, that it does a better job of predicting aging patterns. How do we estimate this? Well, like I said, general additive model has the benefits of treating certain parameters linearly, like we see in the Bradbury method. But unlike the Bradbury method that relies on strong quadratic fit, the general additive model allows the data to decide how age fits with the variable of interest. We estimate this with thin plate regression splines using restricted maximum likelihood.
On the slide is the functional form of the generalized additive model of the cross variant. And as our statistics of interest, we chose OPS, strikeout percentage, walk percentage, and home run percentage, both because they are reliable statistics, but also do a really good job of representing player value. And it should be noted that each of these metrics is adjusted for league and season. So changes in league and season over time is not too much of a concern. Another feature of this gamma cross model that we discussed is the incorporation of the player's career average at the given metric, along with their age. So imagine D. Strange Gordon and Mike Trout. Obviously, those two are going to have wildly different OPSs over their careers, but incorporating their career averages allows you to kind of put them on the same level and allows you to kind of have the data share an aging pattern between the two of them. The alphas and betas here are the linear parameters fit by the model, and the non-parametric term is essentially how the model is flexibly fitting performance with age. And it should be noted this is interacted with league. So the model is essentially flexibly fitting by league and by metric. So within each league metric is a shared distribution, a shared pattern. We use data from 1982, which was the KBO's inception, and therefore we have data from then on across all the leagues. And we removed seasons with less than 100 plate appearances, as small sample size could make the metrics not represent the player's true talent and make things a little wonky. So we removed anything with less than 100 plate appearances. We got the MLB data from the Laman database, about 17,000 player seasons. And for the NPB and KBO data, we got that from baseballreference.com, totaling about 11,000 player seasons across the two leagues.
So what we have here are the distributions of each of our variables. And if you're having trouble differentiating between KBO, MLB, and NPB, that's respective of the fact that there isn't too much of a difference in their relative distributions, that they all follow fairly closely the same shape. The other thing to note from this is the relative normality shape of OPS, strikeout percentage, and walk percentage. That's going to be especially important when we talk about standardizing our outcome variables, compared to home run percentage, which has a obviously right skew distribution. So how we address home run percentage is going to be different than how we address the other three variables. So moving to our first set of aging curves, let me walk you through how to read this plot. So this is for OPS. We have plots for each of the leagues, KBO, MLB, and NPB. On the top half of the slide, we have plots that are based on the raw metric, so OPS not adjusted whatsoever. The bottom plot, we have the aging curves where the outcome measure OPS is adjusted by league and by season. We do this with z-scores because the data is fairly normally distributed, so we are able to use that standardizing technique. You'll notice on the slide that there's a number kind of in the middle of each of the plots. This number and the corresponding vertical line, dash vertical line, represent the calculated peak. You could see for in the bottom sets of plots that the calculated peak for OPS is around 26 to 27 years old for each of the leagues. You'll also see two sets of dashed lines to the left and to the right of that peak. And what those represent are the range in which the peak is not statistically different, essentially. It's basically, we believe that the peak is within this interval as opposed to thinking of the peak as a raw number. So it's a way to think about it as opposed to you peak at this age. No, it's more like this stat peaks over this interval. It's kind of a way to think about it. Strikeout percentage, and what's important here is that this illustrates why it's important that we standardize the data. So the top set of plots, once again, does not standardize. It uses raw strikeout percentage, where basically all the plots follow a fairly similar shape. Strikeout percentage starts high, it drops. Why? Because, well, we like drop strikeout percentages. We don't like batters that necessarily strike out. So that's a good thing when their strikeout percentages drop. And then what the top plots show is that it eventually increases. The bottom plots show a different story, though. They drop, just like in the top set of plots, but then they plateau. What's driving that? Well, two things are happening during our sample period. First, strikeout percentages are going up across each of the leagues over time. And then two, ages are going up very slightly over each of the leagues over time. So these two variables are moving together. So if you didn't control for the change in league offensive environments and strikeout environments, you might mistakenly attribute strikeout percentage or aging or strikeout percentage to aging. So once you control, once you league neutralize, you get this plateau effect, which typically you see starts occurring around the age of 27.
Walk percentage features notably the latest peak among the four metrics we investigated, with all leagues showing their peaks around the age of 30. It is notable that across all the leagues, the shape of the aging curve for walk percentage is pretty consistent and relatively level around the peak. Looking at home run percentage, it's important to note that the bottom plot, instead of being on the scale of z-score, is on the scale of percentile. Because remember, home run percentage is not normally distributed. We saw it right skewed. So we use percentile as kind of the target measure instead. And we can see, looking across the leagues, that the peak is around 26 to 29. But interestingly, the MLB has the sharpest peak. If we look at the range of its peak interval, it is relatively narrow compared to the KBO and NPB curves. Looking at all of our preferred specifications, standardized by the league and year, we can see an interesting pattern comparing the four measures. Walk percentage and strike percentage have later peaks and notably flatter peaks. It's more of a plateau than a peak in the true sense of the word. This suggests when we're thinking about aging as a balance between physical and experience, that plate discipline, as measured by strikeout percentage and walk percentage, age the best. Those are the tools that don't necessarily decline as steeply with a physical decline. But while these curves are strong representations of how players in the various leagues change in performance over time, the question still remains, how do we tell if these differences between the leagues are significant? To do so, we essentially take the parabolas, we take the curves that we just built, and then we overlay them and subtract one from the other. So take a look at the plot in the top left. This compares the OPS differences between the MLB and KBO. By subtracting one from the other, a positive number means that MLB players are relatively better than KBO players at that age relative to their peak, while a negative number means KBO players are better than MLB players at that age relative to their peak. So in the plot at the top left, we can see the gray band of standard error leaves the horizontal dotted line of 0 at the beginning and the end of the distribution. With it being negative at the front end, that suggests KBO players are entering the league closer to their peak levels than MLB players are, while at the end, the positive number indicates that MLB players are essentially staving off a decline better than KBO players at that same age. So this plot really shows, at least with regard to OPS, that KBO players are entering closer to their peak values and leaving closer and declining more quickly.
So to look at our other metrics, strikeout percentage, not much to see here, not statistically different than 0 in any of the plots. Aging and strikeout percentage looks fairly the same, at least statistically across the different leagues. Walk percentage, we see a story pretty similar to what we saw with OPS, that at the early ages for, again, comparing MLB and NPB to KBO, at the early ages, KBO players are entering the league closer to their peak, whereas MLB and NPB players are lasting or are sustaining their peak longer, that they're closer to their peak at older ages. And once again, comparing MLB and NPB, no statistical difference. So far we've seen no difference between MLB and NPB, but pretty drastic differences between MLB and NPB and KBO. Looking at home run percentile differences, these are, I think, some of the more interesting results. So if we go back to, I'm going to go back to our home run percent aging curves for a second. If we go back here, this was the one example where we saw different shapes in the aging curves and somewhat different peaks. If you look at the KBO, their peak range was lower, between kind of 24 and 29 with a center of 26, compared to MLB, which was a lot more narrow, between 27 and 29, and the NPB that stretched a lot older, going from almost to 32 years of age, lasting their plateau. So we look at these plots. This is the one example where if you look at the middle of the MLB KBO plot, you'll notice that the middle is statistically different than 0. That's representative of a different peak. So as compared to the other plots where we didn't necessarily see a statistically significantly different peak for the different stats, we do for home run percentage. We see it for both MLB versus KBO and MLB versus NPB, reflective of the plot that we showed you before. We also see, especially for MLB, the below the line number for the beginning of for the earlier ages compared to MLB and KBO and MLB and NPB. So we see it for both this time. And again, at the tail of the distribution, we see the MLB line above that dash line against KBO, but not statistically significantly different compared to NPB. So once again, highlighting the shifting nature of differences in the aging patterns.
Looking at the age distribution across the leagues does an interesting job tying it all together, but also posing new questions. So if we see the orange bars on the far left of the graph, that indicates KBO has a higher proportion of players 23 and under than either the MLB and the NPB, and by a fair amount. The blue tip at the top of the mound indicates that the MLB has the highest proportion of players between the ages of 25 and 30. And finally, the right bars on the right side of the screen indicate that the NPB has the highest number of old players that are 30 and over. Now, this is interesting how it coincides with some of our findings. For example, with KBO being younger, we found that KBO players enter closer to their peak and decline more quickly. It's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, but it's pretty interesting that generally our aging curves found KBO players are closer to their peak, better young essentially, and we see a lot of young players in the league. And with MLB, remember, we saw that they had a more definitive home run peak at about 27 years old, and that's where we see the highest proportion of players for them. Again, it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. It's hard to assign causation, but it's pretty interesting how simply looking at the distribution of ages across the league lines up with the aging pattern story pretty well.
So to summarize our conclusions, what we found was essentially, again, our question coming in was, how do aging patterns differ between the leagues? And what we found was that, generally speaking, MLB and NPB players age fairly similarly. There aren't too drastic of differences outside of potentially that peak for home run percentage. KBO players, on the other hand, younger. KBO players enter closer to peak level. And then they typically decline faster of their peak relative to MLB and NPB players. So there is a pretty significant difference when we think about the KBO relative to the other two leagues. What's driving that? Well, again, we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation the number of cultural differences. We don't have a definitive causal statement as to why those differences exist, whether it's differences in league structure and developmental processes, et cetera. But there is something driving those differences. So moving into the future, as you can see, we didn't talk about pitchers at all, but pitchers are absolutely interesting, especially when you think about workload in certain cultures, especially as young players, and how that could potentially impact aging patterns over time. So that's a place we hope to address in the future. We hope to consider league transitions. One of the drawbacks of our model is right now, Ichiro Suzuki counts as two different players in our model, which, to be fair, if you didn't know anything about baseball and you looked at his NPB and MLB stat lines, you would just assume that that's two different players. But right now we treat them separately, but there's a number of really cool questions that we might be able to answer thinking about the transition nature between leagues, especially when you think about projectability moving forward and transition going from one league to another. The last thing we want to look at that we hope to look at in the future are sub-eras. We showed that peak in home run percentage, and part of that, we wonder if it's being driven by the steroid era for MLB. I don't know of a similar quote unquote steroid era for the other leagues. Maybe that exists. Maybe someone can enlighten me on that. But we wonder whether or not that might be driving some of the results. And we're also just generally interested in changes in aging patterns over time, given that you would imagine that that shouldn't necessarily be a static thing over a 40-year period of time. So thank you all for listening to our presentations. We look forward to answering any questions. We have our Twitter handles and emails on the slide here. So definitely reach out if you're interested. And once again, it's an absolute pleasure for us to have the opportunity to speak to you all. So thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so we have a mix of questions online and in person. So, not online yet?
Not online yet, so we need questions.
So I noticed the components that go into OPS later aging peak, because they have OPS itself. Right? OPS had a younger peak than all others and based on balls. Does that mean that batting average is a much earlier peak?
That would make intuitive sense. I guess that would make intuitive sense as to why you're saying OPS peaks younger. Mm-hmm.
To think that OPS would be kind of mixed those
Mm-hmm.
earlier. I'm wondering if batting average might be think that.
Yeah. So I'd imagine it'd be a mix then of like just thinking about the missing components, singles, doubles, triples are kind of like the three missing components of that analysis. So maybe balls in play, beating out some balls in play, extending to extra base hits. That would make sense as kind of the missing piece of the puzzle, explaining why OPS is peaking younger than some of the highlighted components.
And we actually did run hit percentage as well, which should capture at least some of, I mean, that's basically batting average. Yeah, we captured hit percentage and we didn't include it in the slides, but I think if I remember correctly, that's exactly what we saw was that stat did peak younger. Yeah.
KBO and NPB, they largely draw from a single country in terms of, so I wonder to what degree the demographics of those countries would affect the age curves that you see.
Mhm. Yeah, one interesting thing, I mean, I guess that would make sense of why they're kind of opposite ends of the aging spectrum, but just kind of asking around to some people who know more about the KBO than I did, they made an interesting cultural note that in the KBO, it's common if you want to play in the KBO, eventually you just forego playing in college and you go straight out of high school. So that's kind of like one interesting cultural reason why we may be seeing so many players at the age of 18, 19, 20 in the KBO. And then that would also make sense given that I believe the general perception is NPB is a higher level of competition than KBO of, you know, once the players establish themselves, they work themselves over to the NPB. I guess so.
Yeah, I think a lot of them defer that though, if I understand that correctly. When they play baseball, I think I'm not an expert in Korean society by any stretch of the imagination. So
We got some reading to do.
we got some reading to do. I think the answer to the other point of your question though, in regards to kind of the diverse cultures within the US, especially that participate, whether you have Dominican, look at the WBC, right? I think that would be an interesting way to extend the presentation in terms of looking at individual demographic differences in a way to isolate kind of higher level development processes. Because if they all go through the minor leagues, that part is the same, but what they do leading up to that's obviously going to be different in their respective countries. So it's an interesting point to certainly consider.
Last question up there.
Yes, up there.
Got her making comparisons here, like what I've emphasized, when it comes to baseball here, it's really hard to quantify because you have the game is played differently now than what it was a few years ago. That March able to come and play, you have things that were stolen base was kind of taken away, you know what I mean? Not just trying to take the power, right? But you also have lengths of contract for certain people. And let's just say a guy is, so like his 32, 33-year-old season and comes off an injury, you got another guy coming behind him, may not necessarily he can no longer play at that level. He just may not have an opportunity for another team. You know what I mean? And just it's a lot of things that go in there, just and you go back a little bit in baseball, and a picture that's going in the 70s. He has a former player. I'm seeing a picture 4 times in the game as opposed to now. You have specialists, you have guys who are coming, you know, one batter, you know, or I'm sorry, for a specific amount of batter, short time, first out of the game. Some pitchers are going 5-6 innings. I think that's really hard to compare. You know, and it was a little bit different of the game. You know what I'm saying? So, not that you may have like a perfect answer for that, but I just think that if you have not already, just take that into like your research and take those things into you know.
Yeah, I think the short answer to that is we agree. We absolutely think that, and for all the reasons you mentioned, there are reasons to think that aging patterns and how we think about player aging should have changed over time. I think we hope to have addressed at least part of the concerns by league adjusting most of our metrics. So at least we're capturing changes in environment, but you're absolutely correct in that player incentives changing may drive individual player behaviors in ways that especially if you're earlier in your career and you're trying to get a long-term contract, you might behave differently than somebody that's further on in their career. I think that's absolutely a good point. And something that, again, when we start breaking down these sub eras, especially, you start running into the small data problems. It was part of the benefit of using the 40 years of data is that it gave us a large enough data set that we can get fairly concise curves. Once you start breaking that down, you get smaller sample sizes. And part of the drawbacks of a non-parametric type of approach is that it requires a lot of data, but absolutely 100% agree. I think we have time for one more question.
I think you already gave us the one warning.
All right, so one more, good. Not good, not good. All right,
Yeah.
We'll answer, I guess, separately. Oh,
Pretty much.
You factor in players who are injured frequently and out for an extended period of time.
And also, are there cultural differences in how aggressively players go after things like fly balls and against the wall and injure themselves between different leagues?
I'll answer that really quickly. That we don't look at injuries really at all in the context of this. I mean, we're relying pretty heavily on averages and how that comes into play. And unless there's a change in injury behavior over time, which I guess there's some reason to think there might be, given improved science and the likes and nutrition, there might be reason to think that exists. But as long as that's distributed throughout the sample, we're not as concerned that that's driving any of our results. So hopefully quick answer to that question. Thank you all very much.